Before we get into the rest of that chapter, though, I wanted to walk through several of the names that we're going to be hearing. Berai, just some ideas, definitions that hopefully will encourage you to understand a little bit. Berai was the name of Hosea's father, and it means my well, expounder, or well of God, the Lord, well of the Lord. So there's some, I thought that maybe Hosea's dad was a prophet, and Hosea is the son of a prophet, and you can see some of that implication in his name. We also have Israel referenced several times. This comes out of Genesis 32, verses 28. God changes Jacob's name to Israel, and he says, the reason why I'm calling you Israel is because you have struggled with God and men and have prevailed. There's a whole lot of other stuff that's in that, but just realize that God's design for Israel was to prevail, both in their relationship with God and in relationship with men. God wanted them to be those that were prevailing. And obviously, at the time Hosea comes, Israel, northern kingdom, is prevailing. So God is dealing with them based on what he had promised them. However, there's been some problems. Ephraim is the youngest son of Joseph from the land of Egypt. He is born there. His name implies twofold increase, doubly fruitful. However, there's a part of that name in the Hebrew that is connected to exhausted and ashes. Okay. Now, the reason why I threw that in there was because you're going to hear God reference Ephraim at times, and there's an exhaustion. God's like, how long? He calls them to repent, and they don't. And that idea that they're trying to hold, they've exhausted some things, and it didn't work. So this idea of Ephraim being mentioned is a representative of the challenge of the northern kingdom. You'll also see Ephraim mentioned in line with Israel because Ephraim was the area where Samaria, which was the capital city of the northern kingdom, and Ephraim gets to be used as a name. You'll hear Israel for the northern kingdom. You'll hear Ephraim, northern kingdom. You'll hear Samaria mentioned. That's the northern kingdom. And Samaria means watchtower or a watch mountain. Egypt, you'll see Egypt in there, and God reminds them of Egypt, and then he says, you're going to end up in Egypt, and then he says, I won't send you back to Egypt, I'm going to send you to Assyria. Well, Egypt means black land, and it's noted there that the color of the soil in the Nile Delta has a rich darkness to it, and so Egypt comes from an old name that has the idea of black or black soil, and that's kind of the implication there. Assyria is the land of Asher. We'll get into that. Gomer. You'll hear about Gomer in just a little bit. It's a lady. It was actually used for a guy's name as well. But Gomer is understood in the Hebrew as completion, complete, or perfect. Come to an end, part of that idea. And then Diblaim. Diblaim, if I got that right, is Gomer's dad. And of all the people that we wanted to give you something to remember was Diblaim. Two twin fig cakes. 2 cakes of figs. So tonight on your way out, we have a box of fig Newtons. And take 2 cases, if you can take 2 of those packages, and remember Diblaim. Diblaim is Gomer's father, who would be the grandfather of 3 kids who had names that... Have you ever had somebody say, what were those parents thinking when they named these kids? Okay, you may say the same thing of Hosea, but you know that there's a reason why. Here's the next slide. The names, Hosea and Gomer have 3 children to whom Hosea is told to give strange names. The names are symbolic of how God regards the children of the covenant with Israel. The first name was a boy, Jezreel, meaning shameful butchery. How'd you like a name that constantly reminds you of the butcher? Now, I know you've been a butcher, okay, but this is a shameful butcher, and it has to do with the idea of God was going to punish and destroy Israel. Then they had another baby. This time it was a girl, La Ruhamah, meaning not pitied. No, yeah, it's one thing to have a name, but it's another thing to have a name that means something like that. It's the idea that God will no longer have pity or forgive Israel for their mistakes. Now, then they had another boy, and this one was Lo-Ammi, meaning not my people. God rejects the Israelites as God's chosen people. So you have Gomer, completion, complete, perfect. You have Hosea, salvation. Sounds like a good thing, right? God says, name your 3 kids. Something that's going to imply the end, the completion of that nation. Not the rise, but the fall. That's a challenge. I don't know about you, but being named something that's connected to the end of something and having to carry that name the rest of your life, that can be a challenge. Y'all pray for those kids. One more thing before we leave all these names. I came across the thing Gomer. That name is a different name. Oftentimes in our society today we think of Gomer Pyle, you know. And I happened to find that Gomer is a slang. In the medical, on a medical website, I found that a Gomer in the medical profession is an unsophisticated person. In the hospitals, a Gomer is a patient considered irksome by a healthcare provider. Especially a patient with chronic complaints that are trivial or unresponsive to repeated treatment. Now, I had to laugh. I did. I read that and went, oh my goodness, I'm using this at Complainers Anonymous. Don't be a Gomer. Okay. Now, I say that and we laugh about it, but in a few minutes, as we read through this, you're going to realize why I'm saying, don't be a Gomer. Okay. One person, another acronym website, used the word Gomer, Gomer, for the acronym, Get Out of My Emergency Room. And again, a patient who by virtue of personality or kind of complaint is not welcome in an emergency room setting. So take that for what it's worth. Laugh while you can, because we're fixing to get into the first 3 chapters of Hosea, who's challenging us to hear the word of the Lord. Let me make sure I got all my... Oh, yeah. Let's do 1 through 3, and then we'll go back to the slides, Delana. And I understand we're back on the air, so welcome to those of you who are watching. Here we go. Hosea chapter 1, starting with verse 2. When the Lord began to speak to Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, "Go, take yourself a wife of harlotry, and children of harlotry. For the land has committed great harlotry by departing from the Lord." Again, I mentioned this earlier, but the idea that God views his people in that covenant relationship equal to a marriage. So that if his people choose to worship any other god, it is adulterous. And the idea of harlotry is not just a single act of unfaithfulness, but a repeated act of unfaithfulness. Does that make sense? So when he says that there's harlotry, he's not talking about just one incident. Remember, Hosea had 25 years of ministry. He knew Israel. He knew Judah. And when the Lord speaks to him, Hosea gets it. This is not a one incident. This has been years of unfaithfulness to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And we're going to see here in just a little bit what they chose to worship instead of that. But get that in your brain. Take yourself a wife of harlotry. In other words, Hosea, I want you to be a living illustration of what's going on in Israel. Go find a woman who is already unfaithful. Now, some theologians, some historians think that maybe he found a woman who was just unfaithful afterwards. But if you read this, the idea is you find a woman who's already unfaithful in that area of commitment and covenant. Marry her. Again, remember, there's 14 chapters. Don't get hung up on chapters 1 and 3. It's the illustration for what's coming. But it's pretty vivid. It's pretty stark. It's pretty blunt. And then when it says the children of harlotry, some Bible theologians wrote that like mother, like father. No, like mother, like daughter. Like daughter, like mother, like son, like father. That kind of an idea. There's some indication that Gomer had a mom who was also unfaithful. Now, if you know the children of Israel and their history, they were barely out of Egypt when the golden calf took place. So, if we can see that kind of idea that God says to Hosea, I need you to do something for me. Yes, Lord, here I am. I want you to go find a woman who's a harlot. Okay. I want you to marry her. What? And by the way, make sure her mom's a harlot as well. What? I don't know about you, but that whole idea really challenges some people. But this is what God wants us to hear. When we are unfaithful to Him, it hurts. And when we are repeatedly unfaithful, at some point He's going to lovingly confront us. That's point one. Point two is, if God asks you to be the real life illustration, what would you say? Well, I had my eyes set on Miss Daisy over here. We've been talking about marriage for 6 months. I want you to find somebody else. I don't know what Hosea was thinking, and I don't want to try to put any thoughts, but I can only imagine it took him a little bit of prayer and fasting to walk this thing out. Matter of fact, some theologians, some I shouldn't say theologians because I don't know for sure, but there are some individuals who think there's no way that really happened. That it's just an allegory, it's just a story trying to help people understand. However, if God would send Jonah to Nineveh and bring a big fish, if Hosea is saying, Lord, I'll do whatever you say. Here's my life. It's a living sacrifice. I want to be what you want me to be. I'll be your messenger. Just show me what to do. Hosea, I got a job for you. Okay. I want you to be a husband. Yeah. I want you to go find a harlot. Really? Cleaning my ears out? Yeah, and make sure she's the child of a harlot. That's crazy. That's getting hard. Verse 3. We're getting there. We'll get there, I hope. So he went and took, and I got to tell you, I stop right here. Kudos to Hosea, right? There's no verses in here that tell us he argued with God like Jonah. Jonah was like, I ain't going over to Nineveh. We don't see Hosea saying, I'm out of here. God, you've asked something too hard for me. The next verse says, Hosea got up and he went. And he took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim. Don't forget your fig Newtons tonight. And she conceived and bore him a son. Then the Lord said to him, call his name Jezreel, for in a little while I will avenge the bloodshed of Jezreel in the house of Jehu, and bring to an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. It shall come to pass in that day that I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. Now, just bear with me for a few minutes. I hope it's just a few seconds. But Hosea deals with the idea that he's going to marry a woman with a reputation, whose mom had a reputation. Imagine you're there. You're in the restaurant, and in walks a couple. And because you have lived